Stripped of his company and his dignity in a brutal boardroom coup, Dominic Hayes thought he had hit rock bottom. His only inheritance was a rotting library from a forgotten uncle. But hidden inside those mouldering pages wasn't just dust. It was a devastating secret that would rewrite his entire destiny. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 64th floor, mirroring the absolute storm of betrayal unfolding inside the boardroom of Meridian Global. Dominic Hayes sat at the head of the long mahogany table, though the seat of power had already been ripped from beneath him. His tailored charcoal suit felt suddenly like a straitjacket. He stared blankly at the legal documents slid across the polished wood, the crisp white paper glaring at him under the harsh, recessed lighting. Gregory Fitch, the company's majority shareholder, and a man Dominic had foolishly considered a mentor, stood at the opposite end of the room. Fitch was casually buttoning his suit jacket, an infuriatingly serene smile playing on his lips. "It is nothing personal, Dominic," Fitch said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "The board simply feels that Meridian requires a different trajectory, one that does not involve your volatile management style." The vote was unanimous. Dominic's eyes flicked to the right. Amanda Lipton, his chief financial officer, the woman he had personally mentored and promoted when everyone else said she was too inexperienced, refused to meet his gaze. She was staring intently at her silver pen, rolling it back and forth across her legal pad. Her silence was a dagger twisting in his ribs. She had provided the falsified financial projections that Fitch was currently using to justify this execution. "You orchestrated this, Gregory," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the roaring in his ears. "You buried the R&D costs in the Q3 reports to make the domestic division look like it was hemorrhaging capital. You set the fire, and now you're firing the chief for the smoke." "A creative narrative," Fitch replied, gesturing to the two heavily built security contractors standing by the frosted glass doors. "But the Securities and Exchange Commission might view it differently when they review the anonymous whistleblower complaint filed this morning. I suggest you sign the severance waiver, Dominic. Surrender your equity quietly, and perhaps the investigation will lose its momentum." Dominic realized then the sheer depth of the trap. It wasn't just a firing, it was an annihilation. If he fought the termination, Fitch would release the fabricated evidence to the SEC, tying Dominic up in federal court for a decade. His reputation, his life's work gone in the span of a 20-minute meeting. Escorted out of the building he had built with only a cardboard box holding a framed photograph and a handful of pens, Dominic was unceremoniously dumped onto the slick, rain-soaked pavement of downtown Boston. By nightfall, the reality of his ruin had fully settled in, because the company owned his penthouse, his corporate car, and had successfully petitioned to freeze his primary assets. Pending the internal audit, Dominic found himself sitting on the sagging mattress of a cheap motel in South Boston. He stared at the water stains on the ceiling, a bottle of cheap whiskey dangling from his fingertips. He was 42 years old, completely broke, and publicly disgraced. Then his burner phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Winston Carmichael, a senior partner at a boutique estate law firm. The news was brief and delivered with clinical detachment. Dominic's great-uncle, Theodore Beaumont, had passed away in his sleep at the age of 89. Theodore had been a ghost of a man, a recluse, who lived in a decaying townhouse in Beacon Hill. But in his prime, Theodore had been a titan of industry, a ruthless investor who had supposedly amassed a fortune before retreating from society 3 decades ago. Dominic had not seen the old man since he was a teenager, but the sudden mention of an inheritance sparked a frantic, desperate flame of hope in his chest. If Theodore had even a fraction of his rumored wealth left, it could be the lifeline Dominic needed to hire a ruthless defense attorney and tear Gregory Fitch's empire to the ground. The following morning, Dominic sat in Carmichael's oak-paneled office. The lawyer adjusted his spectacles and broke the seal on Theodore's final testament. Dominic held his breath mentally, calculating how much capital he would need to launch a hostile counterstrike on Meridian Global. To my grandnephew Dominic Hayes. Carmichael read aloud, his tone painfully monotone. I leave the entirety of the contents of the library located within the Beacon Hill property. It is my hope that he learns what I learned too late, that true value is rarely found on a balance sheet. Dominic blinked. The contents of the library. What about the property itself, the estate, the liquid assets? Carmichael cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. The Beacon Hill property, along with all liquid assets, stocks, and the remainder of Mr. Beaumont's estate, amounting to roughly $42 million, has been bequeathed to the New England Feline Sanctuary. A cat shelter. Dominic whispered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. He left $42 million to a cat shelter and left me books. Just the books, Mr. Hayes. Carmichael confirmed, sliding a heavy brass key across the desk. And I must inform you the property has already been transferred to the charity's trust. They intend to renovate. You have exactly 7 days to remove your inheritance from the premises before they are disposed of. An hour later, Dominic stood in the center of Theodore Beaumont's library. The smell was overpowering, a suffocating blend of mildew-rotting leather and decades of undisturbed dust. The room was massive, lined from floor to ceiling with sagging mahogany shelves, groaning under the weight of thousands of volumes. Most of the books were severely water-damaged from a leaking roof that had gone ignored for years. Their spines were cracked, their pages yellowed and curled. Dominic walked over to a stack of crumbling encyclopedias on a central reading table. He slammed his fist down on them, sending a cloud of grey dust pluming into the stale air. He was a man who dealt in billions in cutting-edge logistics and global supply chains. Now his entire net worth consisted of rotting paper that even a thrift store would reject. It was the ultimate insult, a cruel joke played by a dead hermit. Defeated Dominic sank into a moth-eaten armchair, burying his face in his hands as the shadows of the decaying room closed in around him. For 3 days, Dominic practically lived in the suffocating gloom of the Beacon Hill Library. With the ticking clock of the 7-day eviction notice hanging over his head, he had desperately attempted to extract any hidden value from the rotting collection. He had called in 3 different antique book appraisers. The final one, a pretentious and nasal-voiced man named Leonard Fisk, had barely spent 10 minutes in the room before rendering his verdict. Glorified kindling, Mr. Hayes. Fisk had sneered, wiping his hands with a linen handkerchief, as if the very air of the room might infect him. A tragedy, really. There might have been some first editions here in the 70s, but the humidity has absolutely destroyed the bindings. The foxing on the pages is irreversible. I could offer you perhaps $600 for the entire lot, mostly just for the scrap paper value. Dominic had thrown Fisk out, his patience completely shattered. $600. It wouldn't even cover a retainer for the lowest-tier paralegal in Boston, let alone the legal armada he needed to fight Gregory Fitch. It was near midnight on the 4th day. Dominic was packing the books into heavy-duty cardboard boxes, working by the dim, flickering light of a single brass lamp. His hands were black with dust and age-old ink. He grabbed a haphazard stack of heavy leather-bound classics from a lower shelf. His grip slipped, and the books cascaded to the hardwood floor with a heavy, concussive thud. He cursed into the empty room, kneeling to gather the scattered volumes. As he reached for a thick, dark green copy of Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, he paused. The book had landed hard on its spine, and the impact had caused the back cover to splay open. Dominic picked it up. He had handled hundreds of books over the last few days, and his hands had grown accustomed to their feel. This volume was wrong. It was far too heavy for its size. He ran his thumb along the back inside cover. The end paper, beautifully marbled in swirls of gold and crimson, seemed slightly raised. It wasn't a hollowed-out safe. He had already checked for those clichés. But the binding near the back was abnormally thick. Dominic took a pocket knife from his coat and carefully slid the blade along the seam of the end paper. The heavy parchment peeled back, revealing not the cardboard backing of the cover, but a perfectly bound, concealed section of pages. It was flawlessly integrated into the spine, hidden in plain sight. Dominic carefully turned to the first hidden page. The typography matched the rest of the 19th century novel perfectly, but the chapter heading was completely alien. It read, Chapter 118, The Architect's Ledger. Dominic frowned. He knew the Dumas classic well enough to know it ended long before 118 chapters. He turned the page. There was no prose. Instead, the page was covered in dense, meticulously printed columns of numbers, dates, and what looked like routing codes. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He sat back in the moth-eaten chair and pulled the lamp closer. As he scanned the columns, a pattern emerged. These weren't random strings of data. They were transaction records, massive ones. Millions of dollars moving through a labyrinth of shell companies' offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and blind trusts in Liechtenstein. But it wasn't just numbers. Every few pages there was a block of text, typed in a small, precise font. It was a cipher, but not a particularly complex one. It relied on a substitution method. Dominic, whose early career had been built on algorithmic data, parsing recognized the underlying structure. He grabbed a pen and a legal pad from his box of meager belongings and began to work. Hours bled away. The rain returned, drumming a steady rhythmic beat against the boarded-up windows. Dominic didn't notice. The deeper he translated, the colder his blood became. Great-uncle Theodore had not just been a recluse. He had been a silent partner, a shadow investor who retained backdoor access to the financial mainframes of half a dozen massive conglomerates. And one of those conglomerates was the parent company of Meridian Global. Dominic translated a paragraph near the middle of the hidden chapter. His pen stopped. The ink bled into the yellowed paper. Subject GF, discretionary fund diversion. Account 884 Bravo. Annual bleed 14.2 left. Subject GF. Gregory Fitch. Dominic stared at the letters until they blurred. Theodore had known. For over a decade, Theodore Beaumont had been quietly tracking and documenting Gregory Fitch's systematic embezzlement from the very company Fitch had just weaponized against Dominic. Fitch had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars, laundering it through the corporate structures he controlled, and pinning the financial discrepancies on aggressive R&D spending and executives like Dominic. But the ledger didn't just expose Fitch. The final pages of the secret chapter contained the access keys, the cryptographic passwords to a digital vault where Theodore had hoarded the absolute, undeniable proof. Bank transfers, recorded phone transcripts, and the true unfalsified ledgers of Meridian Global. Theodore had locked the detonator to Fitch's empire inside a book about ultimate revenge, knowing that a man as arrogant as Fitch would never look for a digital kill switch inside a rotting 19th century library. Suddenly, the silence of the room was shattered by the shrill ring of Dominic's burner phone. He jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He looked at the glowing screen. Unknown number. He let it ring 3 times before pressing accept. Mr. Hayes, a crisp, unfamiliar voice said. My name is Arthur Vance. Apologies, Arthur Sterling. Wait. The voice paused, correcting itself seamlessly. My name is Julian. No, my name is Marcus. Damn it. Dominic frowned, the hair on the back of his neck standing up as the caller seemed to cycle through identities before finally settling. My name is Victor Sterling, the voice finally said, smooth and practiced. I represent a private collector. We understand you recently inherited the Beaumont Library. My client is a purist. He is willing to offer you $250,000 for the collection, sight unseen. But we must take possession tonight. Dominic's eyes drifted from the phone to the decoded ledger to the initials GF. $250,000 for water-damaged kindling. They didn't want the books. Fitch had realized Theodore was dead. Fitch knew what the old man possessed, and he was terrified of what might be hidden in the one place the lawyers couldn't easily seize. $250,000, Dominic replied, his voice dropping an octave, losing all the desperation of the past week. That's a generous offer for moldy paper Victor. My client is eccentric, the voice said tightly. Do we have a deal, Mr. Hayes? Dominic looked at the open copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face in the dim light. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. Tell your client, Dominic said softly, that the library is no longer for sale. He hung up the click, echoing in the dusty room. He had exactly 72 hours before Fitch's people simply broke in and burned the place to the ground. He needed to find the digital vault, and he needed to do it before the men currently hunting him realized he already held the map. Dominic shoved the weathered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo deep into the inner pocket of his damp overcoat, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his throat. He did not have the luxury of time. The chilling detachment in Victor's voice during the phone call was all the confirmation he needed. Gregory Fitch was tying up loose ends, and Dominic's inherited library was the final frayed thread. Working with frantic precision, Dominic grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag he had purchased earlier that week for his clothes. He abandoned his meager personal belongings, instead stuffing the bag with the specific volumes that Theodore Beaumont had cross-referenced in the hidden ledger. Wealth of Nations, a hollowed-out Gray's Anatomy, containing a cluster of encrypted flash drives, and a seemingly mundane 998 edition of the Farmer's Almanac that held routing numbers scribbled in the margins. He killed the brass lamp, plunging the library into suffocating darkness, and moved toward the servants' stairs at the back of the townhouse. Just as his hand grasped the rusted iron railing, the unmistakable sound of splintering wood echoed from the front of the house. Heavy boots thudded against the marble foyer. They had not bothered to wait 72 hours. Dominic slipped down the narrow staircase, holding his breath as dust plumed around his face. He navigated the pitch-black cellar by memory, aiming for the old coal chute that opened into the narrow alleyway behind Beacon Hill. Above him, the violent sounds of bookshelves being torn apart and glass shattering vibrated through the floorboards. They were tearing the room to pieces, looking for the ledger. He squeezed through the iron door of the chute, tumbling out into the freezing Boston rain, just as a flashlight beam swept across the basement stairs inside. He ran. He did not stop until he reached the neon-lit sanctuary of a 24-hour diner in Cambridge. Dripping wet and shivering, Dominic slid into a corner booth, ordered a black coffee, and spread the documents across the sticky Formica table. To access Theodore's digital vault, Dominic needed a secure terminal with direct, unfiltered access to Meridian Global's internal intranet. A public Wi-Fi connection would immediately trigger the cybersecurity tripwires Fitch had undoubtedly installed. The cryptographic keys were utterly useless if he couldn't reach the door. He needed an inside man, or more accurately, an inside woman. At 3 in the morning, Dominic stood in the hallway of a luxury high-rise in Back Bay, pounding his fist against a heavy mahogany door. When Amanda Lipton finally opened it, her eyes were bloodshot, and she held a heavy brass candlestick tightly in her right hand. "Dominic," she whispered, her face draining of color. "Are you insane? If company security sees you on the lobby cameras, Fitch will have you arrested for stalking. Let me in, Amanda." Dominic said, his voice hard, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Unless you want the SEC knocking on this door tomorrow morning instead of me." Amanda hesitated, her eyes darting nervously down the empty carpeted hallway before stepping back to let him pass. Her apartment was a testament to the blood money Fitch was paying her sleek, minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Charles River, and original abstract art on the walls. "You have 5 minutes," she said, wrapping her silk robe tighter around herself. "Then I'm calling the police. You shouldn't be here. It's over, Dominic. You lost." "I thought I lost," Dominic corrected, dropping the heavy canvas duffel bag onto her pristine glass coffee table. "Until my great-uncle left me a map to where all the bodies are buried." He pulled out the decoded pages of the Dumas novel and slapped them down on the glass. He pointed directly to the column of transactions he had translated. "Take a good look, Amanda," Dominic commanded. "Account 884, Bravo. The Cayman routing numbers. The systematic bleeding of the R&D budget that you personally signed off on. My uncle tracked every single dollar Fitch stole, and he tracked exactly how you manipulated the quarterly projections to cover his tracks." Amanda leaned forward, her eyes scanning the handwritten translation. The candlestick slipped from her grip, landing on the thick wool rug with a dull thud. Her breathing became shallow and erratic as she recognized the exact financial discrepancies she had worked so hard to hide. "This is impossible," she stammered, her corporate armor shattering in an instant. "How did you get this?" Fitch said the encryption on the ghost accounts was military grade. "My uncle was an architect of the old banking systems," Dominic replied coldly. "He built the back doors that Fitch's software sits on. Now listen to me carefully. Fitch is going to burn you. When the anonymous whistleblower complaint triggers a federal audit, who do you think is going to take the fall for the falsified ledgers? The CEO with plausible deniability, or the CFO who actually authorized the transfers?" Tears welled in Amanda's eyes. The crushing reality of her situation was finally setting in. "He promised me immunity," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of her expensive sofa. "He said he was finalizing a buyout with Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, a private equity takeover. They're taking Meridian Global private on Monday morning. Once the company goes private, the books are sealed, the public audit is cancelled, and the SEC investigation loses its jurisdiction." Dominic's blood ran cold. Monday morning. It was currently Saturday. He had barely 48 hours before Fitch effectively erased the crime scene and vanished with billions of dollars. "Then we have to crash the party," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I have the access keys to Theodore's vault, which contains the unedited original ledgers. But I need your administrative credentials to bypass the external firewall and inject the decryption protocol directly into Meridian's mainframe." Amanda looked up at him, terrified. "If we fail, Fitch will destroy us both. He has people, Dominic. Dangerous people." "They already burned down my uncle's library tonight," Dominic stated flatly. "They are coming for us anyway, Amanda. The only way out of the burning building is to walk through the fire." Monday morning arrived with a suffocating tension that settled over the financial district like a heavy fog. Inside the executive boardroom on the 64th floor of Meridian Global, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a scene of opulent celebration. Crystal glasses clinked, and the rich scent of expensive espresso filled the air. Gregory Fitch stood at the head of the table, his signature serene smile wider than ever. Surrounding him were the senior partners of Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, flanked by an army of corporate attorneys. The privatization documents, a stack of paper worth over $6 billion, sat in the center of the mahogany table, waiting for the final signatures. "Gentlemen," Fitch announced, smoothly raising a glass of sparkling water, "today marks the evolution of Meridian Global. By moving into the private sector, we free ourselves from the suffocating red tape of public scrutiny, allowing us to innovate at the speed of the modern market." He uncapped his solid gold fountain pen, lowering it toward the signature line of the master contract. "I think you'll find the market doesn't look too kindly on federal embezzlement, Gregory." The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent crash. Dominic Hayes strode into the room. His charcoal suit impeccably pressed his posture, radiating absolute authority. Flanking him were three men wearing stern expressions and dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI. Fitch's pen stopped a millimeter above the paper. The serene smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "Security!" Fitch barked, his eyes darting toward the door. How did this disgraced lunatic get up here? "Your security protocols were overridden by your chief financial officer," Dominic said loudly, stepping up to the mahogany table. He threw a thick black binder directly onto the privatization contracts. "Amanda Lipton has decided she prefers being a cooperating state witness over spending the next 20 years in federal prison." The KKR executives immediately stepped back from the table, their corporate instincts sensing the radioactive fallout about to occur. "This is a desperate stunt," Fitch sneered, though a bead of sweat broke out along his hairline. "Officers, this man was fired for gross incompetence and financial mismanagement. He is a trespasser. Arrest him." "We aren't here for Mr. Hayes," the lead FBI agent stated, pulling a folded warrant from his jacket pocket. "Gregory Fitch, we have a federal warrant for your arrest, as well as a court order to seize all digital assets, servers, and physical files belonging to Meridian Global." Dominic stepped closer to Fitch, leaning over the table. "While you were popping champagne, Gregory, my uncle's decryption algorithm was running through your mainframe. We unlocked the vault. We have the routing numbers for account 884 Bravo. We have the Cayman Island wire transfers. We have 14 years of your personal, unfalsified ledgers. It's over." Fitch's face turned a mottled apoplectic red. He lunged across the table, not at Dominic, but toward the black binder. Before his hands could even graze the leather cover, two federal agents grabbed his arms, wrenching them behind his back with practiced efficiency. "You think a pile of moldy books and a dead hermit can take me down?" Fitch spat, his composure entirely shattered, as the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "I built this company. You are nothing without me." "Dominic." "You built a house of cards," Dominic replied quietly, watching as the man who had destroyed his life was publicly humiliated in front of the most powerful financial players in the city. "And my uncle left me the wind." As Fitch was frog-marched out of the boardroom, shouting obscenities that echoed down the glass corridors, the KKR executives hurriedly packed their briefcases, the multi-billion-dollar deal evaporating into thin air. Dominic stood alone at the head of the table. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the chaotic Boston traffic moving far below. The rain had finally stopped, and harsh, brilliant sunlight was breaking through the gray clouds illuminating the city. The aftermath was swift and brutal. With Amanda Lipton's testimony and Theodore Beaumont's undeniable digital evidence, the SACC completely dismantled Fitch's shadow empire. Fitch was indicted on 47 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The board of directors, terrified of federal implication, immediately purged Fitch's loyalists and offered Dominic Hayes full reinstatement as CEO along with a massive equity compensation package to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. 3 months later, Dominic stood inside the newly renovated Beacon Hill townhouse. He had bought the property back from the feline sanctuary for double its market value. The mildew and rot were gone, replaced by polished mahogany, climate-controlled air, and brilliant modern lighting. He walked over to a glass display case, sitting in the very center of the expansive library. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was the weathered, water-damaged copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. It was a worthless book, by any appraiser's standard, a piece of glorified kindling. But as Dominic ran his hand over the protective glass, he knew the truth. It was the most valuable asset he would ever own. Theodore Beaumont had understood the true nature of wealth. It wasn't found in stock options, corporate cars, or offshore accounts. True wealth was the knowledge to protect yourself, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the ultimate devastating power of the truth. Dominic smiled, turning his back on the book, and walked out into the sunlight to run his empire. Did this dramatic story of absolute betrayal and brilliant underdog revenge keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching a disgraced CEO turn a worthless inheritance into the ultimate weapon against corporate greed, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a true comeback story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life financial mysteries, dramatic twists, and stories of justice served cold.